In the final centuries of the Roman Republic, power no longer relied solely on legions or laws. It depended on belief. Rome was expanding faster than it could morally contain. Provinces stretched from the cold Atlantic edge to the deserts of Syria. Millions lived under Roman rule, who had never chosen it. Order had to be maintained, not just through force, but through persuasion carefully shaped, relentlessly repeated. Propaganda in Rome was not a side effect of politics. It was infrastructure. Triumphs carved into stone, coins stamped with chosen faces. Public speeches rehearsed to frame conquest as destiny. Rome learned early that violence alone bred resistance. Stories, however, could shape obedience. They could teach people what to fear, what to admire, and who deserved suffering. This is the kind of history that disappears when people look away. Share this video with your friends so it isn't erased again. And drop your city or country in the comments so we can see how far this story reaches. Power was presented as natural, hierarchy as inevitable. Rome at the center of the world, others orbiting as lesser beings. Behind the marble temples and orderly forums lay a state acutely aware of its fragility. Civil war had shown how quickly loyalty dissolved. So the message had to be constant. Rome was virtuous. Rome was disciplined. Rome was chosen. Those who opposed it were not simply enemies. They were immoral, weak, corrupt, dangerous to the social body. This was the beginning of a system where control did not end with conquest. It entered the mind. By the 1st century BCE, violence in Rome was no longer confined to battlefields or back alleys. It was staged, organized, placed in the open air where it could be seen, absorbed, and understood. Execution was never just punishment. It was instruction. Crucifixions lined roads leading into cities, bodies left to rot under the sun. The message traveled before the stench did. Disobedience ended here. Resistance earned slow, public death. There was no need for explanation. The spectacle spoke in silence. The condemned were stripped, exposed, and fixed in positions meant to humiliate as much as to kill. Pain was prolonged. Time was weaponized. The crowd learned patience as they watched lungs fail and muscles tear. Violence became a shared civic experience. Public executions trained the population. They taught what power looked like when it was absolute. They also taught people where they stood. Slaves, rebels, and the conquered were made examples because their suffering was considered useful. Their bodies became tools for shaping behavior. Fear was not hidden. It was cultivated. The crowd was never innocent. Attendance was expected. Absence was suspicious. To watch was to participate. To understand the lesson was to survive. In Rome, brutality was not chaos. It was grammar. In Rome, reputation was a battlefield as real as any frontier. Sexual accusation became one of the most efficient weapons deployed against political enemies, because it attacked legitimacy at its root. Power in Roman culture was inseparable from dominance. To rule was to penetrate socially, legally, militarily. To be ruled was to submit. This logic extended beyond the bedroom into law courts, speeches, and public rumor. Men accused of sexual passivity were portrayed as unfit to command. Effeminacy was framed as weakness. Desire outside approved hierarchies was treated as a threat to order itself. A rival did not need to be defeated. He needed to be feminized in the public imagination. Political speeches circulated allegations of debauchery, moral softness, and uncontrolled appetite. These claims rarely required proof. The damage lay in repetition. Once a man was associated with sexual disorder, authority drained from him. Respect followed. Sexual violence, meanwhile, was rarely described as crime when committed by those with status. It was reframed as privilege, conquest, or correction. The shame was assigned not to the perpetrator, but to the body that had been used. This system trained citizens to associate power with control over others' bodies, and to view humiliation as a legitimate political tool. Sexual morality was not about ethics. It was about hierarchy. Rome understood that fear of disgrace could be more paralyzing than fear of death, and it used that fear carefully. Rome did not describe itself as brutal. It described itself as necessary. From the Senate floor to the frontier camps, a single narrative was repeated with disciplined consistency. Rome brought order where there was chaos, law where there was savagery, reason where there was excess. Violence was not denied, was reframed as correction. Conquered peoples were labeled parpare, a word that flattened entire cultures into noise and disorder. Their customs were portrayed as obscene, irrational, or dangerous. By contrast, Roman discipline was elevated as moral superiority. Expansion became a civic duty, not a choice. This myth required careful editing. Atrocities were stripped of context and repackaged as justice. Mass enslavements were described as stabilization. Cities burned for refusing obedience were recorded as pacified. Public monuments reinforced the story. Reliefs showed calm Roman soldiers, controlled and composed, while enemies appeared twisted, chaotic, and defeated. The brutality of conquest was frozen into images of balance and restraint. Citizens absorbed this mythology early. Boys were taught that Roman virtue justified domination. Girls learned that honor required silence and endurance. Doubt was treated as weakness. Sympathy for the conquered was treated as betrayal. By turning violence into morality, Rome removed the need for remorse, and by repeating the story often enough, it made cruelty feel clean. In Roman political memory, women rarely appeared as people. They appeared as warnings. Stories of violated women were circulated with precision, not compassion. Their suffering was transformed into justification used to explain wars, laws, and the consolidation of male authority. The woman's body became a narrative device, her voice absent, her trauma honor was framed as something a woman carried for the state, not for herself. When that honor was taken, responsibility quietly shifted onto her. Silence was expected. Endurance was praised. Grief was tolerated only if it served a political outcome. Roman law reflected this logic. Sexual violence was treated as an offense against male ownership, not female autonomy. A woman's violation mattered primarily in relation to her father, husband, or household. Her body existed within a system of control that denied it independence. Public rhetoric reinforced the lesson. Women were portrayed as vessels of virtue or sources of chaos, rarely as moral agents. Their suffering was invoked to inspire male outrage, then discarded once obedience was restored. This propaganda taught citizens to see women not as victims, but as symbols of purity, of dishonor, of political necessity. By removing women's humanity from the story, Rome made their exploitation feel distant, abstract, and acceptable. And that distance was deliberate. Rome built its empire on human ownership, then taught itself to stop seeing it. Enslavement was described not as theft of life, but as correction. Captives were labeled uncivilized, incapable of self-rule, in need of Roman order. Chains were presented as guidance, obedience as improvement. Legal language did the work quietly. A slave was defined as property, a speaking tool, a body without standing. Violence against them required no justification, because the law had already removed their personhood. What could not legally suffer did not morally matter. Markets made the system ordinary. Bodies were inspected, priced, and sorted in daylight. Children were separated without comment. Sexual access was assumed. Labor was extracted until collapse. None of this was framed as cruelty. It was framed as economy. Propaganda softened the edges. Roman writers emphasized loyal slaves, grateful slaves, slaves improved by discipline. The reality whippings, branding, sexual coercion, and routine death was pushed to the margins, described as excess rather than structure. This rebranding allowed citizens to live surrounded by suffering without naming it. To question slavery was to question Roman identity itself. By calling domination civilization, Rome ensured the system would endure and taught later societies how to do the same. Religion in Rome was not a refuge from power. It was one of its sharpest instruments. The gods were presented as guardians of order, deeply invested in Rome's expansion and hierarchy. Victory in war was framed as divine approval. Defeat was explained as ritual failure, not moral doubt. The system left no space to question whether conquest itself was wrong. Omens, sacrifices, and priestly declarations shaped public behavior. An unfavorable sign could delay elections, justify executions, or silence opposition. Authority did not argue, it interpreted the will of the gods. Fear was central. Natural disasters, plagues, and military losses were blamed on moral disobedience. Someone had offended the divine order. Someone had to be punished. Collective anxiety was redirected toward control. Religious language also excused brutality. Mass killings were reframed as purification. Suppression of dissent became spiritual necessity. Violence was no longer a human choice, was obedience to something higher. Those who resisted Roman rule were portrayed as impious, cursed, or dangerous to cosmic balance. To destroy them was not cruelty. It was protection. By binding power to the divine, Rome made resistance feel not just illegal, but sacrilegious. And moral fear did the rest. Rome did not tolerate opposition. It redefined it. Rebels, protesters, and resistors were stripped of political identity and recast as criminals. They were not portrayed as people reacting to occupation or exploitation, but as threats to or infectious, irrational, and violent by nature. Language did the damage first. Dissenters were labeled brigands, pirates, or beasts. Their motives were erased. Their grievances ignored. Once dehumanized, their destruction required no explanation. Collective punishment followed. Villages were burned to discourage memory. Families were executed to erase lineage. Survivors were enslaved or scattered so resistance could not organize again. The lesson was clear. Resistance did not just fail it, contaminated everything around it. Public punishment reinforced the narrative. Leaders of revolts were humiliated before death, their bodies displayed to collapse any remaining loyalty. The crowd was meant to see not courage, but disgrace. This system taught obedience through fear and isolation. To speak out was to become untouchable. To sympathize was to risk being reclassified as the same kind of threat. Rome understood that control required more than force. It required teaching people to fear one another. The arenas of Rome were more than entertainment. They were classrooms in cruelty. Gladiatorial games, beast hunts, and staged executions were engineered to condition citizens to accept pain, blood, and death as ordinary. The crowd was a witness, a participant, and an instrument of control. Watching was compulsory, in its own way. To look away was to deny the lessons being taught. Each strike of the sword, each roar of the wild animal, each death that unfolded slowly under the sun was a message. Fear was internalized. Compassion was calibrated. The emotional response of the spectator became a tool of the state. The design was subtle. Battles were choreographed to highlight Roman skill, strength, and discipline, contrasting them against the weakness of the vanquished. Humanity of the defeated was minimized. Their suffering was as pain became normalized, even expected. Over time, citizens absorbed the logic without noticing. Violence was not just premedita, was anticipated. Children grew up believing that the line between spectacle and reality was thin, that endurance of brutality was a civic virtue, and that empathy for the powerless was dangerous. Rome's greatest triumph in the arena was not defeating, but it was conquering minds. By desensitizing the population, it created a society that could witness horror and still function, still obey, still believe in the myth of its virtue. Rome's power extended beyond the living. It reached into memory itself. History was not recorded neutrally. It was curated, edited, and sculpted to serve the state. Victories were immortalized in triumphal arches and inscriptions, while defeats, massacres, and scandals were minimized or erased. Those who suffered or resisted were often omitted entirely, their existence forgotten by design. Senators and emperors understood that controlling the story meant controlling perception. Propaganda was embedded in annals, poems, and speeches, giving future generations a version of reality where Rome was always virtuous, just, and inevitable. Brutality disappeared behind the veneer of order and destiny. Monuments became mnemonic devices. Aeac carving each dedication told the story the state wanted remembered. Romans disciplined, enemies chaotic, and rebellion punished. Memory was weaponized. Forgetting was part of governance. This control over narrative trained citizens to accept selective truth. The human cost of conquest, the suffering of the vanquished, the manipulation of religion and morality all faded into silence. Rome did not just conquer lands, it conquered perception. By shaping memory, Rome ensured obedience, not only in the present, but in the imagination of the future. History itself became a tool of domination. In Rome, power and manhood were inseparable. Authority was measured not merely by position, but by the ability to dominate others socially, politically, and to question a ruler's strength was to question the very structure of society. Emperors and generals cultivated a public persona rooted in dominance. Sexual violence, humiliation, and coercion were framed not as crimes, but as demonstrations of entitlement. Effeminacy in men was political weakness. Subjugation of women and slaves was proof of capability. Violence became a currency of legitimacy. Toxic masculinity was enforced at every level. Boys learned from a young age that respect demanded intimidation. Public shaming, physical punishment, and sexual conquest were all lessons in control. Fear and aggression were rewarded. Compassion and restraint were discouraged. The logic extended into politics. Rivals were feminized, disgraced, or publicly shamed to strip them of authority. The message was unambiguous. To rule, one must dominate. To fail to dominate was to fail Rome. This culture created a cycle. Authority justified brutality, and brutality reinforced authority. Sexual exploitation, public humiliation, and physical coercion were not anomalies, they were mechanisms integral to the maintenance of power and social hierarchy. Rome's model of masculinity was not only enforced by law and custom, it was celebrated, taught, and weaponized, leaving a legacy that would echo through centuries. Rome's laws were precise, cold, and unyielding, but also remarkably flexible in the service of power. Violence, exploitation, and coercion could be codified, disguised, and rendered morally invisible through bureaucratic language. A master could punish, a magistrate could execute, a soldier could enslave, and the law provided cover. Legal terminology reframed suffering as duty, obedience, or necessary correction. Words like asterisk, disciplina asterisk, pietas, and justitia masked cruelty beneath layers of procedural righteousness. Courts became theaters of moral camouflage. Accusations of corruption or disloyalty often depended on the manipulation of definitions. Terms like treason or impiety were applied selectively, legitimizing brutality while delegitimizing dissent. Justice became a tool for control rather than a safeguard for the innocent. Even sexual exploitation was sanitized through legal frameworks. Ownership, guardianship, and status-defined consent and accountability. The state's language transformed acts of domination into permissible behavior while silencing the victims. By dressing cruelty in legality, Rome trained its citizens to accept acts that might otherwise provoke outrage. Bureaucracy replaced conscience. Procedure substituted for morality, and the machinery of control continued, unnoticed and unquestioned. In Rome, to follow the law was to participate in violence, often without ever seeing it for what it truly was. Rome's conquest did not end with armies or governors. It extended into the hearts and minds of the conquered. Subjugated peoples were not only forced to obey, were compelled to believe in their own inferiority. Public rituals, language, and propaganda painted compliance as virtue and resistance as vice. Shame was internalized. Fear became habitual. Rebellion became unthinkable. Education, citizenship, and religion were tools of assimilation. Children were taught Roman ideals of honor, loyalty, and virtue, ideals defined by obedience to Rome. Local customs were erased or reframed as backward, dangerous, or immoral. Memory of resistance faded under the weight of repetition and indoctrination. Victims of conquest learned to police themselves. Deviance from Roman norms invited social punishment, loss of status, or suspicion. In this way, control was sustained not just by force, but by psychological dominance. The conquered absorbed the narratives that justified their suffering, carrying the lessons into homes, schools, and families. The colonized mind became Rome's quietest victory. It ensured that domination persisted long after armies withdrew, and that generations grew accustomed to a world where power was absolute and dissent was unthinkable. The empire ruled Boda's Yesbut, It ruled perception even more thoroughly. The echoes of Rome's propaganda did not vanish with its empire. They were absorbed, reinterpreted, and woven into the fabric of later societies. Ideas of virtue, masculinity, and authority were transmitted through law, literature, and education. Conquest was reframed as civilization. Control was justified as protection. The sanitized version of Roman morality became a blueprint for empires that followed teaching obedience, normalizing exploitation, and obscuring human cost. Even in modern political rhetoric, echoes remain. Leaders are celebrated for strength, while cruelty is excused or ignored. Victims are silenced or rendered symbols. Cultural hierarchies are reinforced by narratives that claim inevitability, destiny, or moral superiority. Monuments may crumble, empires may fall, but the stories persist. They shape how power is understood, how obedience is taught, and how violence is rationalized. The myths are subtle, embedded in language, culture, and law, but they are effective, enduring, and often invisible. Rome's most successful conquest was not of land, nor even of people. It was of perception itself, and its legacy still molds thought, behavior, and belief long after the empire disappeared. The empire crumbled, but its shadows lingered. Rome did not vanish. It persisted in the stories people told, the laws they obeyed, the ideals they revered. Its propaganda survived as a blueprint for power hidden in plain sight. Military conquest became synonymous with civilization. Domination masqueraded as virtue. Masculinity was defined by the ability to control, punish, and humiliate. Cultural hierarchies were justified through narratives of inevitability, moral superiority, and destiny. These lessons seeped into subsequent empires, whispered into the education of rulers, citizens, and subjects alike. Even today, the echoes remain. Political language sanitizes brutality. Histories are selective, emphasizing victories and virtue while erasing suffering. Social structures normalize obedience, shame, and fear, often without recognition. The mechanisms of control invisible in the forum or on the battlefield now operate invisibly in minds shaped by centuries of inherited ideology. Rome's most enduring conquest was never of territory. It was of perception itself. And in that conquest, its myths continue to dictate how power is wielded, how obedience is maintained, and how cruelty is justified long after the empire itself has disappeared. Belief has a price. In Rome, the cost was measured in bodies, minds, and souls. Those who accepted the official narratives of virtue, destiny, and order often ignored suffering in plain sight. The conquered were invisible. The enslaved were tools. Women, children, and dissenters were symbols, not people. To see otherwise was to risk exile, punishment, or death. To speak otherwise was to invite erasure. Citizens were complicit, not always by choice, but by design. Fear, indoctrination, and shame-shaped behavior as effectively as armies ever could. Obedience became internalized. Moral questions were silenced. Even empathy could feel dangerous. For the victims, the consequences were absolute. Lives were destroyed, families torn apart, and memories erased. Trauma passed silently from one generation to the next, amplified by culture and law that denied its existence. Pain became invisible, yet its echoes persisted, reshaping communities, identities, and societies. Rome's propaganda did more than maintain power. It trained the world to accept injustice, to normalize cruelty, and to measure worth by conformity rather than humanity. The cost of believing the story was not abstract. It was the destruction of human life, dignity, and memory. Rome left more than roads, aqueducts, and laws. It left a system of control so pervasive that its influence stretches into the present. Power, carefully packaged as virtue, became a model. Violence, framed as necessity, became a lesson in obedience. Sexual exploitation, public humiliation, and psychological manipulation were codified into culture, leaving patterns that outlasted emperors and armies. The empire taught that survival required submission, that morality could be subordinated to hierarchy, and that history could be rewritten to serve those in control. Those who remembered the truth were silenced. Those who forgot became carriers of its myths. To study Rome is to confront a paradox. Civilization built on conquest, order maintained through terror, and morality defined by power. The shadow it casts stretches across centuries, shaping thought, law, and society long after its monuments have crumbled. If the lessons of Rome are ignored, history's cycles repeat. Its power survives not in territory, but in minds willing or forced to accept its narratives. The empire is gone, but its echoes remain. For more stories lost to silence, but found in the shadows, join Historian.